Picture, if you will, a 70-room palace perched on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, where the Atlantic crashes against ancient rocks and the wind carries the salt spray up to marble terraces that once hosted the most powerful family in America, a house so vast that its owners occupied it for barely 10 weeks each summer, a monument to wealth so staggering that the man who built it could have bought entire cities with his pocket change, yet within these walls echoes a story far darker than the glittering chandeliers and gold leaf would suggest, because the breakers, the crown jewel of Gilded Age excess, stands not merely as a testament to American ambition but as a monument to a family consumed by its own fortune, destroyed by the very railroad empire that built it, haunted by tragedy, scandal, and the terrible realization that all their millions couldn't buy the one thing they desperately needed, peace. What dark truths would these Italian marble walls reveal if they could speak? What price did the Vanderbilt family truly pay for their position atop America's first great fortune, and who were the invisible hands that built and maintained this palace while the country outside its gilded gates starved and bled? This is not the fairy tale of American success you were taught in school, this is the real story of the breakers, and it begins not with triumph, but with a man slowly suffocating under the weight of a name too heavy for any human to bear. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, named for his legendary grandfather, the Commodore, the man who built the New York Central Railroad and died the richest man in America, was born into a destiny he never chose, thrust into the role of dynasty builder when he was still learning to walk, raised in the shadow of a grandfather whose ruthlessness was legendary, whose business practices were so brutal that competitors called him the most hated man in America, whose dying words to his sons were reportedly about money, always about money, because in the Vanderbilt universe, there was nothing else that mattered. Cornelius too grew up in a world where love was transactional, where family dinners were business meetings, where his father, William Henry Vanderbilt, doubled the family fortune in just 8 years through sheer, relentless exploitation of the railroad workers who died by the hundreds building his lines, their bodies crushed under steel and buried in unmarked graves while the Vanderbilts commissioned portraits and built summer cottages that cost more than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. But young Cornelius was different, or at least he wanted to be. He attended Yale, studied seriously, showed genuine interest in the welfare of railroad workers, established a YMCA for young working men, donated to charities with genuine feeling rather than as calculated public relations, married Alice Claypool Gwynn, a woman of impeccable social standing but not, notably, of comparable wealth. A love match by the standards of their class, which meant they at least tolerated each other's company at breakfast, and together they had 7 children, a proper dynasty in the making, heirs to the greatest fortune America had ever seen. Yet even as Cornelius tried to be the good Vanderbilt, the moral Vanderbilt, the one who might somehow redeem the family name from the blood and suffering that built it, he found himself trapped, because the railroad empire demanded constant attention, constant expansion, constant ruthlessness, and his father, William Henry, the man who famously said, "The public be damned," when asked about the welfare of railroad passengers, made it clear that Cornelius would inherit not just wealth but responsibility, not just money but an obligation to grow it, to fight off the other robber barons, to crush unions, to buy politicians, to do whatever was necessary to maintain the Vanderbilt supremacy over America's transportation network. The pressure was unimaginable, the stress constant, and by his 40s, Cornelius too was already showing signs of the strain, his health deteriorating, his famous reserve cracking occasionally to reveal a deeply exhausted man who sometimes wondered, in his private moments, whether any amount of money was worth this burden, but he couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, because to do so would be to betray his grandfather's legacy, to admit weakness, to invite the wolves of Wall Street to tear apart everything 3 generations had built. In 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt died suddenly of a stroke, and overnight, Cornelius too found himself at the head of the family, the chairman of the New York Central Railroad, the manager of an estate worth over $200 million, more than $5 billion in today's money, and the pressure nearly killed him on the spot, because suddenly every decision about every mile of track, every labor dispute, every stock manipulation, every bribe to every crooked politician, all of it landed on his desk. And the other robber barons, men like Jay Gould and James J. Hill, circled like sharks, sensing that Cornelius too lacked his grandfather's killer instinct, lacked his father's casual cruelty, and they began to probe, to test, to attack the Vanderbilt lines, and Cornelius fought back the only way he knew how, by working himself nearly to death, sleeping 4 hours a night, chain-smoking cigars, drinking coffee by the pot, his hands shaking as he signed documents that sent men to their deaths in railroad construction accidents, that authorized strikebreakers to attack workers demanding an 8-hour day, that funneled millions to senators and congressmen to kill legislation that might have improved working conditions, and all the while he maintained the fiction that he was the good Vanderbilt, the charitable one, the one who cared, even as the bodies piled up and the fortune grew. It was in this context, this pressure cooker of guilt and responsibility and crushing expectation, that Alice Vanderbilt decided her family needed a proper summer cottage in Newport, because Newport, Rhode Island, had become the ultimate arena for America's new aristocracy, the place where the robber barons competed not through business but through architecture, where Mrs. Astor held court, where the 400, the exact number of people who could fit in her ballroom, determined who mattered and who didn't in American high society, and the Vanderbilts, for all their money, were still considered new money, still tainted by the Commodore's reputation as a ruthless, barely educated steamboat captain who used to spit tobacco juice on the floor during business meetings, still fighting for acceptance among families whose fortunes came from respectable sources like slave trading, opium smuggling, and colonial land theft rather than vulgar railroads. The Vanderbilts already owned a cottage in Newport, a modest wooden structure called the Breakers that William Henry had purchased in 1885, but it wasn't enough, not nearly enough, because Mrs. Astor had Beechwood, and the Belmonts had Belcourt, and Alva Vanderbilt, married to Cornelius's younger brother William K., had just completed Marble House, a $50 million temple to herself that made every other Newport cottage look like a garden shed, and Alice refused to be outshone by her sister-in-law, refused to accept second place in the hierarchy of American wealth, so she pushed Cornelius to build something bigger, grander, more expensive, something that would make an undeniable statement. The Vanderbilts were not just rich, they were royalty, American royalty, and anyone who doubted it could come to Newport and see the proof carved in stone and gold. But fate, or perhaps justice, intervened before any plans could be made, because in November 1892, the original wooden Breakers cottage burned to the ground in a fire so intense that witnesses claimed they could see the flames from 10 miles away, and though the official cause was listed as a defective furnace, rumors swirled immediately about arson, about rival families, about disgruntled servants, about symbolic destruction, because fires at these massive estates were never simple accidents, they were always weighted with meaning, always seemed to occur at moments of transition or crisis, and the timing was almost too perfect, giving Alice the excuse she needed to demand something entirely new, something fireproof, something that would last forever as a monument to Vanderbilt power. Cornelius, exhausted and increasingly unwell, nevertheless agreed, perhaps because saying no to Alice was impossible, perhaps because some part of him believed that building the greatest house in America might somehow prove something, might justify the guilt, might transform the blood money into something beautiful and therefore, in his tortured logic, redemptive, and he wrote a check that made even other robber barons gasp. $5 million for the house alone, another $2 million for furnishings, more than $200 million in today's money, for a summer cottage they would occupy for 10 weeks per year, and he hired the only architect in America who could possibly execute such a vision, Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the man who had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, who had built palaces for the Astors and the Belmonts, who understood that these weren't homes but stages, theaters where the American aristocracy performed their right to rule. Hunt took one look at the cliff-top site, at the raw Atlantic power crashing against the rocks below, and he understood immediately that this house had to be indestructible, a fortress, a statement of permanence in a world where everything else was burning down, and he drew inspiration from the Italian Renaissance, from the palaces of Genoa and Turin, from the villas where merchant princes had ruled their empires 5 centuries earlier, creating a design that would make the Breakers not just a house but a manifesto, a declaration that the Vanderbilts were the American Medici, that their wealth was as legitimate and as permanent as any European dynasty, conveniently forgetting that the Medici had also been ruthless bankers whose fortune rested on exploitation, and that their palaces had eventually been stormed by mobs, their treasures scattered, their dynasty ended, because history, it turns out, has a dark sense of humor about the dreams of the powerful. Construction began in 1893, just as America plunged into one of the worst economic depressions in its history, the Panic of 1893, when banks collapsed, railroads went bankrupt, unemployment soared to 20%, when breadlines stretched for blocks in every major city, when workers who'd lost everything contemplated revolution, when the gap between the wealthy and everyone else became so obscene that even some robber barons privately worried about guillotines being erected on Fifth Avenue. And yet the breakers rose, a massive construction site employing thousands of workers who earned pennies per hour to build a palace for a man who earned more in a single day from his investments than they would see in their entire lives, and the symbolism was so blatant, so offensive, that editorial cartoonists had a field day, drawing Cornelius Vanderbilt as a bloated plutocrat feasting while skeletons labored below. But he didn't care, couldn't afford to care, because stopping now would be weakness, would be surrender, would be an admission that maybe, just maybe, there was something obscene about building a 70-room Italian palazzo while the country starved. The construction itself was a feat of engineering and organization that rivaled the building of the railroads, because Hunt insisted that the breakers be absolutely fireproof, which meant that instead of the wooden frame construction typical of Newport cottages, the entire structure had to be built of steel, limestone, brick, and marble, with no wood used in the main structure except for interior cabinetry. And every piece of stone, every ton of marble, every steel beam had to be shipped to Newport and then hauled up the cliff, requiring a small army of stonemasons. Iron workers, plasterers, and laborers working in shifts from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, for 2 solid years, and this was before modern construction equipment, before cranes and forklifts and power tools, so everything was done with human muscle, with pulleys and ramps and raw, brutal labor, the same kind of labor that had built the railroads, and the same kind of expendable workers, immigrants mostly, Italians and Irish and Eastern Europeans who'd fled poverty in their homelands only to find themselves working conditions barely better in the land of opportunity, risking their lives on scaffolding 50 feet above the rocks, breathing stone dust that would give them silicosis, handling caustic materials that burned their hands, all for wages so low that they lived in crowded boarding houses, 10 to a room, eating bread and beans, while up on the cliff, the palazzo took shape, its walls rising 40 feet high, its roof supported by massive steel trusses, its exterior clad in Indiana limestone so carefully carved that each block fit perfectly with its neighbors, creating the illusion of a single, monolithic structure that had stood for centuries rather than being assembled by desperate men in just 2 years. But the exterior was merely the beginning, the foundation for what would happen inside, because Hunt and the Vanderbilts were determined that the breakers would surpass anything in America, that it would rival the great palaces of Europe, and to achieve this they turned to European craftsmen, hiring entire workshops from France and Italy, bringing them across the Atlantic to Newport where they worked in specialized studios, creating interiors of such elaborate ornamentation that they seemed to drip with gold, literally drip with it, because gold leaf covered the walls of the dining room, the ceilings of the music room, the frames of the mirrors, the carved details of the fireplace mantels, creating a shimmering, overwhelming effect that was meant to inspire awe but often inspired something closer to vertigo, a sensory overload of wealth, because every surface was activated, every inch decorated, nothing left plain or simple, no space for the eye to rest, the Rococo horror vacui taken to its absolute extreme. The Great Hall, rising 2 full stories with a massive glass and steel skyline, was modeled after the central courts of Italian palaces, its walls covered in limestone carved with classical motifs, its floors in inlaid marble creating geometric patterns that cost more per square foot than most American families paid for their entire houses, and visitors entering through the massive bronze front doors, themselves works of art cast in Paris, would stop dead, literally freeze in place. Overwhelmed by the scale and the opulence, which was precisely the point, because every inch of the breakers was designed to remind visitors exactly who the Vanderbilts were and where they stood in the American hierarchy. The music room, decorated entirely by French designer Jules Allard Fils who created it in their Paris workshops and then shipped it to Newport in pieces to be reassembled like an elaborate three-dimensional puzzle, featured walls of carved and gilded wood, a ceiling painted with classical seams, furniture so delicate and ornate that it barely seemed functional, And a massive fireplace surround that incorporated dozens of different colored marbles arranged in patterns so complex that you could stare at them for hours and keep discovering new details. And this was just one room, just one of 70, and the message was clear: there is no limit to our wealth, no boundary to our taste, no challenge we cannot overcome through the application of sufficient money. The dining room, perhaps the most important space in any Newport cottage, because this is where the real business of society happened, where alliances were formed and reputations made or destroyed over 12-course meals served on gold plate, was a temple to excess, its walls covered in rare rose Numidian marble columns from Algeria, its ceiling adorned with an elaborate plaster and gilt relief of Flemish Baroque style that seemed to writhe and twist overhead like frozen flames, its massive chandeliers containing hundreds of electric lights at a time when most of America still used candles and oil lamps, because the Breakers was one of the first fully electrified houses in the country, a technological marvel as well as an architectural one, with its own power plant hidden away in the basement, generating electricity to power not just lights but also elevators, dumbwaiters, call buttons for summoning servants, and a revolutionary heating system that used steam pipes embedded in the walls, no radiators visible because visible functional objects were considered vulgar, everything had to be hidden, the machinery of comfort invisible, maintaining the illusion that this palace simply existed in a state of perfect temperature and perfect light through some natural magic rather than through the labor of engineers and servants. And labor was the foundation of everything at the Breakers, though you would never know it from the spaces the family and their guests occupied, because the house was actually two houses, two completely separate worlds occupying the same structure, with the public rooms and family bedrooms representing perhaps 20% of the total space while the remaining 80% consisted of the elaborate infrastructure required to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury, the massive basement. Kitchens where teams of chefs worked over coal-fired ranges in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees, preparing the elaborate multi-course meals that were then loaded onto dumbwaiters and sent up to the dining room where they would arrive at precisely the right temperature, the pantries where footmen polished silver for hours each day because Mrs. Vanderbilt insisted that every piece shine like a mirror, the wine cellars requiring separate teams just to maintain proper temperature and humidity, the servants' quarters on the third floor where 30 permanent staff members lived in small, plain rooms that were sweltering in summer and freezing in winter, furnished with simple iron bedsteads and washstands, no decoration, no comfort, because servants were expected to be invisible, to exist only in relation to their function, their humanity subordinated entirely to the smooth operation of the house. The staff hierarchy at the Breakers replicated the rigid class system of a small nation, with the butler reigning supreme over the male servants, his authority absolute in matters of service, wines, and household protocol, while the housekeeper commanded the female staff, the maids and laundresses and kitchen workers, and between them they managed an organization as complex as any business, with detailed job descriptions, shift schedules, quality standards, and an elaborate protocol for how servants should move through the house, which stairs they could use, when they could be visible and when they must vanish, because one of the cardinal rules of service in a house like the Breakers was that servants should never be seen unless actively performing a task, they should materialize when needed and evaporate when finished, as if the house cleaned itself, as if meals appeared by magic, as if fires spontaneously ignited in the fireplaces and the flowers in the vases arranged themselves. The human cost of this invisible labor was staggering but never acknowledged, because the servants who worked at the Breakers were expected to be grateful for the opportunity, grateful to work 16-hour days, grateful to sacrifice their own family lives and personal ambitions to maintain the comfort of people who barely acknowledged their existence, who might pass them in a corridor without a glance, who learned their names only if they proved particularly competent or particularly incompetent, and the wages, while better than many working-class jobs of the era, were still a pittance compared to the wealth they served, with the highest-paid servants earning perhaps $800 per year while the family spent more than that on flowers for a single party, and there was no retirement plan, no job security, no recourse if you were dismissed on a whim, and the emotional toll of constantly performing deference, of erasing your own personality and opinions, of accepting that you were, in the eyes of your employers, fundamentally less human than they were, is something that can't be calculated in dollars but that marked every servant who worked in these palaces, creating a particular kind of psychological damage that they would carry for the rest of their lives. The breakers was completed in 1895, just 2 years after construction began, a timeline so compressed that it required punishing overtime and the importation of even more workers, and the opening was marked by a party so lavish that it became legendary in Newport society, with 500 guests, orchestras playing in multiple rooms, champagne flowing from fountains, food prepared by chefs brought from Delmonico's in New York because even the capable staff at the breakers couldn't handle a party of this scale, and the cost for that single evening was estimated at over $200,000, more than the annual budget of some small towns, but it achieved its purpose because everyone who attended left convinced that the Vanderbilts had definitively won the Newport arms race, that no one could possibly top the breakers, that this was the pinnacle of American domestic architecture and probably would remain so forever, and in a sense they were right, because even as other wealthy families built increasingly elaborate cottages in the following years, none quite matched the scale and grandeur of the breakers, which stood on its cliff like a declaration of victory, like a monument to the idea that America's new aristocracy had arrived and wasn't going anywhere. But even in that moment of triumph, there were cracks, subtle signs that all was not well in the kingdom Cornelius II had built, because Cornelius himself barely attended the opening party, making only a brief appearance before retreating to his rooms, exhausted, his hands shaking, his color poor, and close observers noted that he seemed to have aged a decade in the 2 years of construction, that the stress of managing both the railroad empire and this massive building project had taken a terrible toll, and his doctors were privately warning Alice that her husband was headed for a complete breakdown if he didn't rest, truly rest, which meant giving up the railroad, giving up the business, giving up the identity that had defined 3 generations of Vanderbilt men, and of course he refused, couldn't even imagine it, because a Vanderbilt who wasn't working was a Vanderbilt who was dying, so he pushed on, spending his days in the Manhattan offices managing the railroad, fighting off corporate raiders, crushing strikes, bribing legislators, and then escaping to the breakers on weekends where he was supposed to relax but instead found himself entertaining an endless parade of guests, playing the role of host, performing wealth and power for the audience of American society, never able to simply stop, never able to simply be, because that's what the breakers demanded. It was not a home but a stage, not a refuge but a theater, and the performance never ended. Every meal was a production, every conversation a potential alliance or betrayal, every moment calibrated and calculated, and the exhaustion of it, the sheer unrelenting pressure of performing your own life, was slowly killing him. In August 1896, just 1 year after the breakers opened, Cornelius Vanderbilt II suffered a massive stroke while in his New York offices, collapsing at his desk in the middle of reviewing financial statements, and he was rushed back to the breakers where he lay paralyzed on the right side, unable to speak clearly, unable to walk, his brilliant mind trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him, and the doctors told Alice privately that he would likely never fully recover, that the best she could hope for was that he might regain some movement, some speech, but he would never again be the man who had run the railroad, and the irony was almost too perfect, too on the nose, because here was the man who had built the greatest summer palace in America, who had spent $7 million to create a monument to Vanderbilt power, and he would spend the rest of his life trapped in it, wheeled through its magnificent rooms in a chair, looking at the gold leaf and the marble, and the masterwork craftsmanship that had cost so much and achieved so little, because what good was a palace if you were imprisoned in your own body, what good was wealth if it couldn't buy health, couldn't buy peace, couldn't buy back the years you'd sacrificed to accumulate it. Cornelius lingered for 3 more years, 3 long years during which Alice became the de facto head of the family, managing the social obligations, hosting the parties, maintaining the performance while her husband sat silently in his wheelchair, a ghost in his own house, and the servants whispered about how sad it was, how tragic, though none of them mentioned that his railroad had killed thousands of workers, that his fortune was built on exploitation, that perhaps there was a kind of justice in watching the richest man in America reduced to helplessness, and when Cornelius finally died in September 1899, at the age of 55, worn out and used up by the burden of being a Vanderbilt, the newspapers wrote eloquent tributes to his charity and his business acumen, but they didn't mention the labor conditions on his railroads, didn't mention the political corruption, didn't mention the vast disparity between his 70-room palace and the 1-room tenements where his workers lived, because that would have been impolite, would have violated the unspoken agreement that the wealthy must be treated with deference even in death, especially in death, because to speak honestly about the source of their fortunes would be to question the entire system, and America in 1899 wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't ready to confront the reality that the Gilded Age was gilded precisely because something ugly and rotten lay underneath. Alice Vanderbilt inherited the breakers and most of Cornelius's fortune, and she lived in the house for another 35 years, becoming one of the grand dames of Newport society, the woman everyone wanted to impress, the hostess whose invitation meant you'd arrived, and she ruled the breakers like a queen, maintaining every tradition, every ritual, every exhausting performance of wealth and status. Even as the world around her changed, even as the certainties of the Gilded Age began to crumble, because the early 20th century brought challenges that even Vanderbilt wealth couldn't entirely control, the rise of the labor movement, the Progressive Era reforms, the income tax in 1913 which suddenly made maintaining these vast estates much more expensive, and then World War I which disrupted international trade and made the conspicuous consumption of the Gilded Age seem obscene in a world of rationing and sacrifice, and Alice, to her credit, adapted, allowing the breakers to be used for Red Cross events, hosting fundraisers for the war effort, performing a new role as patriotic aristocrat rather than simply wealthy dilettante, but the writing was on the wall, the age of the robber barons was ending, and the generation that came after them would face a very different America. The 1920s brought a brief resurgence of prosperity and excess, and the breakers once again hosted legendary parties, now featuring jazz bands and cocktails and the scandalous new dances that made Victorian hostesses clutch their pearls, and Alice, now in her 70s, adapted to the new era with surprising grace, allowing her younger relatives to essentially take over the social calendar while she retreated more and more into the role of matriarch, the keeper of traditions, the living link to the age of her late husband, and she began to think about legacy, about what would happen to the breakers after she died, because the economics of maintaining such a house were becoming increasingly impossible, the property taxes alone were crushing, the cost of staff and maintenance and heating and upkeep ran to hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, and the younger generation didn't seem interested in the burden of keeping up these vast palaces, they wanted smaller, more manageable homes, wanted to travel and enjoy their wealth rather than being chained to the maintenance of monuments, and Alice realized, perhaps with some bitterness, that she might be the last person to truly live at the breakers in the way it was intended, that after her death the house would either be sold or demolished or transformed into something else entirely, because the age of private palaces in America was coming to an end, killed by taxes and changing values and the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, there was something wrong with a system that allowed one family to have 70 rooms while others had none. The Great Depression hit the Vanderbilt family hard, not because they became poor, even depleted, the family fortune remained vast by any normal standard, but because it destroyed the social and economic system that had justified their wealth, because suddenly the newspapers were full of stories about breadlines and foreclosures and families living in Hoovervilles, and the contrast with the breakers, still lit up like a beacon on the Newport cliffs for the summer season, became impossible to ignore, and there were real fears of revolution, of class war, of mobs storming the mansions of the wealthy, and some Newport families seriously discussed installing machine guns in their attics, hiring private security forces, building escape tunnels, because the terror of the rich is always the terror that the poor will someday stop accepting their lot and demand actual justice rather than charity. And though America never quite tipped into revolution, the New Deal represented a kind of negotiated settlement, a recognition that unchecked capitalism had failed, that the market couldn't be trusted to regulate itself, that the government needed to intervene to prevent the system from consuming itself, and for the old robber baron families, this felt like betrayal, felt like theft, because suddenly they were being asked to pay for Social Security and unemployment insurance and minimum wages. Suddenly there were regulations about working conditions and child labor, suddenly the government was suggesting that maybe businesses owed something to their workers and their communities beyond the absolute minimum required to keep them alive and productive, and Alice Vanderbilt, now in her 80s and increasingly frail, watched this transformation with mixed feelings, because on one hand she'd seen the human cost of unregulated capitalism, had seen what it did to her husband, had seen the exhaustion and desperation of working people, but on the other hand, this was her world. That was ending, these were her values being questioned, and she couldn't quite bring herself to fully embrace the new order, so she retreated further into the breakers, into the past, into the world where Vanderbilts were unquestioned aristocrats and the social order was clear and everyone knew their place. Alice died in 1934, at the age of 89, and her daughter Gladys inherited the breakers, but Gladys had no intention of living there year-round or even spending full summers there. The house was too big, too expensive, too much a relic of a dead era, and for several years it seemed likely that the breakers would be demolished, the land sold off for development, the treasures auctioned, the building itself torn down because the cost of maintenance exceeded any possible use, and this fate had already befallen many of the other great Newport cottages, destroyed in the name of economy and progress, their materials salvaged, their sites subdivided, their memories erased, and the breakers seemed likely to follow until, in 1948, Gladys made a decision that would have been unthinkable in her mother's era. She leased the breakers to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year, allowing the house to be open to the public as a museum, transforming it from a private palace into a public monument, and this decision, practical though it was, represented a profound shift in how Americans thought about these Gilded Age mansions, because suddenly they weren't just embarrassing reminders of inequality, they were historical documents, they were artifacts of a particular moment in American history that needed to be preserved and studied and, yes, critiqued, because to understand America you had to understand the Gilded Age, had to confront the reality that the country's industrial might was built on exploitation, that the magnificent mansions and the miserable slums were two sides of the same coin, that you couldn't have one without the other, and the breakers, open to tourists who paid 50 cents to gawk at the gold leaf and marble and try to imagine what it was like to live with such wealth, became a kind of teaching tool, a way of making visible the invisible systems of power and labor that had shaped American capitalism. The decision to open the breakers to the public was controversial among the remaining Newport elite, who saw it as a betrayal, as the Vanderbilts selling out their class, because once you let the tourists in, once you allowed ordinary people to walk through the rooms and touch the banisters and peek into the bedrooms, you destroyed the mystique, you revealed that these houses were just buildings, that the people who'd lived in them were just people, privileged and powerful people certainly, but not fundamentally different, not touched by some special grace that justified their position at the top of the social hierarchy, and this democratization of access to formerly elite spaces was part of a broader post-war transformation in American culture, a questioning of authority and hierarchy that would eventually explode into the social movements of the 1960s, but it started here. In the 1940s and 50s, when returning veterans who'd fought fascism abroad demanded a more democratic society at home, when the old WASP elite began to lose its stranglehold on American culture and politics, when the consensus began to emerge that maybe extreme inequality was bad for society, maybe concentrations of wealth and power should be limited, maybe the Gilded Age wasn't something to celebrate but something to learn from and not repeat, and the breakers, open to the masses, became a symbol of this shift, a recognition that these palaces belonged not to individual families but to the nation, were part of American heritage for better or worse, were documents that needed to be read and interpreted and argued over rather than simply preserved behind locked gates as private treasures. The early tours of the breakers, led by volunteers from the Preservation Society, focused heavily on the architectural details, the artistic merit, the craftsmanship, treating the house as an aesthetic object rather than a social document, and this was understandable given the era, because openly criticizing the robber barons while taking money from their descendants would have been impolitic. But it also meant that visitors left with a somewhat sanitized version of the story, a tale of American success and artistic achievement that glossed over the labor conditions, the political corruption, the vast inequality that made the breakers possible, and it would take decades, really until the 1990s and 2000s, before museums and historic houses began to tell more complete, more honest, more uncomfortable stories about the Gilded Age and the people who prospered during it. The breakers in the second half of the 20th century became something unexpected, a mirror in which Americans could see their own relationship with wealth and power, because the tourists who flocked to Newport weren't just curious about architecture or interested in history, they were working out their own feelings about class, about inequality, about the American dream and whether it was real or a con, and different visitors saw very different things in the same rooms. Some saw inspiration, proof that Americans could build anything, could achieve greatness, could compete with the old aristocracies of Europe, while others saw obscenity, saw the visible evidence of exploitation, saw in every gold leaf sealing the stolen wages of railroad workers, saw in every marble column the broken bodies of the men who'd quarried and carved and installed it, and both interpretations were correct, because the breakers is both things simultaneously, is both a masterpiece of architecture and a monument to inequality, is both a testament to human achievement and a reminder of human cruelty, and the fact that it can be both, that these contradictions can coexist in the same structure, is perhaps the most American thing about it, because America itself is a contradiction, a nation founded on ideals of equality and opportunity that has always been structured around profound inequality and exploitation, and the breakers, open to the public, became a space where these contradictions could be confronted rather than denied. The historical scholarship around the breakers and the other Newport mansions evolved significantly in recent decades, as historians gained access to family archives, servant records, business documents, all the material that had been locked away or destroyed, and what emerged was a much more complex and disturbing picture than the earlier celebratory narratives had suggested, because the documents revealed the full extent of the labor exploitation, the political corruption, the environmental destruction, the human cost of Gilded Age fortunes, and they also revealed something perhaps more unexpected, that the Vanderbilts themselves were often unhappy, that Cornelius II was essentially worked to death by the burden of his inheritance, that Alice spent decades performing a role rather than living a life, that the children and grandchildren struggled with the weight of expectation, with addiction, with purposelessness, with the terrible knowledge that nothing they could achieve would ever match the founding generation, and this humanization of the Vanderbilts, this recognition that extreme wealth doesn't buy happiness and often brings its own forms of suffering, doesn't excuse their exploitation of workers or their corruption of democracy, but it does complicate the narrative, does force us to recognize that the Gilded Age hurt everyone, rich and poor, just in very different ways, and that perhaps the real tragedy of the breakers is not just that it was built on exploitation but that it failed even to deliver happiness to the people who commissioned it, that Cornelius II spent $7 million and got a palace he was too sick to enjoy, that Alice spent 35 years maintaining a performance that exhausted her, that the house which was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of Vanderbilt's success became instead a monument to the emptiness of wealth without purpose, money without meaning, power without peace. The breakers today, maintained by the Preservation Society and visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists each year, has evolved in its interpretation, with newer exhibits and tours attempting to tell the fuller story, to include the servant's perspective, to acknowledge the labor and the cost, to present the breakers not as a fairy tale but as a complex historical document that raises uncomfortable questions about American capitalism, about wealth and power, about who benefits from economic systems and who pays the price, and this shift in interpretation reflects broader cultural changes, reflects the growing awareness that the Gilded Age parallels our own era in troubling ways, because once again we live in a time of extreme inequality, once again we have billionaires building vast estates while working people struggle to afford rent, once again we have political systems corrupted by money, labor unions under attack, regulations dismantled in the name of economic freedom, and the breakers, viewed through this lens, becomes not just a historical curiosity but a warning, a reminder of where unregulated capitalism leads, a visualization of what happens when society allows wealth to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands until the disparity becomes so extreme that the social fabric begins to tear, and the fact that we're having to relearn these lessons, that we're repeating the mistakes of the Gilded Age after a century in which we should have learned better, suggests something troubling about American memory, about our capacity to learn from history, about the power of wealth to rewrite narratives and convince each new generation that this time will be different, that extreme inequality is natural and necessary and even beneficial, that the wealthy are wealthy because they're superior, that the poor are poor because they're inferior, and that any attempt to redistribute wealth or regulate capitalism is theft and tyranny, and the breakers stands as a counterargument to all of this, as evidence that extreme wealth doesn't indicate virtue, that grand houses rest on exploitation, that the fairy tale of American aristocracy is built on a foundation of suffering that we ignore at our peril. The architectural influence of the breakers extended far beyond Newport, because in the decades after it was built, the design vocabulary of Gilded Age mansions, the classical columns, the ornate plasterwork, the grand staircases, the visible wealth, became the template for how popular culture depicts old money, how movies and television shows signal that a character is wealthy and powerful, and this visual language is so ingrained that we barely notice it, but it means that the breakers end. Houses like it have shaped how Americans think wealth should look, have created expectations about what success means, and this is perhaps the most insidious legacy of the Gilded Age, because it planted in the American imagination the idea that vast private wealth is not just acceptable but admirable, that building a palace is an appropriate use of money, that extreme inequality is natural and even beautiful, and this cultural programming, this aesthetic colonization, makes it much harder to critique the contemporary wealthy, because we've been trained to see their mansions and their yachts and their private jets not as grotesque hoarding but as symbols of achievement, as things to aspire to rather than things to abolish, and breaking free from this programming, learning to see the breakers not as beautiful but as obscene, not as inspiring but as damning, requires a conscious effort to resist a century of cultural conditioning, requires us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own complicity in systems of inequality, about whether touring these mansions and admiring their craftsmanship makes us participants in the sanitization of exploitation, about whether historic preservation sometimes serves to legitimize rather than critique the concentration of wealth and power, and these are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers, but they're necessary questions if we're serious about understanding American history and building a more equitable future. The final tragedy of the breakers, the thing that perhaps Cornelius Vanderbilt II understood in his last years when he sat paralyzed in his wheelchair looking at the rooms he'd commissioned, is that all of it was temporary, that despite spending $7 million to build a house that would last forever, that would be fireproof and weatherproof and timeproof, a monument to Vanderbilt permanence, the family barely kept it for 2 generations before economic reality forced them to give it up. And the railroad empire that built it lasted barely longer, absorbed into other companies, the Vanderbilt name reduced to a logo and a memory, and the fortune that seemed inexhaustible, that seemed like it could never be spent no matter how many palaces were built, was largely dissipated within 3 generations, divided among heirs, depleted by taxes, reduced by poor investments and changing economic conditions, because it turns out that even the greatest fortunes are vulnerable to time, that concentration of wealth is temporary, that dynasties fall, that the wheel turns, and the mighty are brought low, and perhaps there's some comfort in this, some justice in knowing that the breakers, which was supposed to prove that the Vanderbilts would rule America forever, instead proved the opposite, proved that even $7 million palaces can't buy permanence, that even the railroad kings are subject to the same forces of change and decay as everyone else, that wealth is not armor against mortality, that you can't buy immortality or immunity from suffering, that the house always wins in the end, and the house, in this case, is time, is history, is the inevitable leveling that reduces even the grandest ambitions to ruins and lessons and tourist attractions, where strangers walk through your bedroom and critique your taste in wallpaper. The breakers endures, but not as the Vanderbilts intended, not as a private palace but as a public museum, not as a celebration of their success but as a complicated monument to an era that combined incredible achievement with terrible injustice, that built beautiful things through ugly means, that proved both the power and the limits of wealth, and in this transformation from private luxury to public education, from palace to museum, from celebration to critique, there is perhaps a kind of redemption, a way of taking something built on exploitation and repurposing it for understanding, using the very monument the Vanderbilts erected to their own glory as a tool for teaching about inequality and labor and the costs of capitalism, and this is the only kind of justice we can extract from history, the only way to make these houses serve a purpose beyond their original intent, by refusing to let them be just beautiful, by insisting that we tell the full story, the dark story, the true story of who paid for the gold leaf and the marble, who laid the stones and polished the silver and worked 16-hour days for pennies so that one family could have 70 rooms for 10 weeks per summer, and in telling that story, in refusing to sanitize or sentimentalize the Gilded Age, we honor not the Vanderbilts but the thousands of workers whose names we'll never know, whose labor built not just the breakers but the entire infrastructure of American industrial capitalism, the men who died in railroad accidents and mine collapses and factory fires, the women who worked themselves to exhaustion in tenements and sweatshops, the children who never got to be children because they were too busy working, all the invisible people whose suffering made possible the visible splendor, and the breakers, properly understood, is their monument too, is evidence of what they built and what was taken from them, is a massive, Beautiful, terrible reminder that every fortune has a human cost. That every palace rests on a foundation of suffering, and that America, if it wants to understand itself, must confront the full truth of its Gilded Age rather than just admiring the architecture, must look beyond the gold leaf to see the blood and sweat that paid for it, must recognize that the breakers is not one story but many stories, and the most important ones are the stories we almost lost. The stories that were deliberately hidden, the stories of the people who made this palace possible. But never got to live in it, never benefited from it, never saw their own labor reflected in the soaring ceilings and elaborate carvings, and in remembering them, in telling their stories, we begin the work of historical justice, the long, difficult work of seeing clearly, of refusing easy narratives, of acknowledging that American greatness, such as it is, was built by millions of workers who never got credit and never got paid what they were worth, and that every magnificent building, every engineering marvel, every sign of progress and achievement, came at a price that someone else paid, and until we fully account for that price, until we acknowledge the debt, until we tell the complete story, the dark story, the true story, we're just tourists in our own history, admiring surfaces without understanding depths, celebrating outcomes without examining methods, and the breakers. That 70-room palace on the Newport cliffs where the Atlantic crashes against the rocks and the wind carries salt spray up to the marble terraces, stands waiting for us to finally see it clearly, to understand what it really is, not a monument to success but a monument to everything success costs, not a fairy tale but a ghost story, not a dream but a warning that echoes across more than a century, asking us whether we'll learn from the past or whether we're doomed to build our own breakers, to repeat the same mistakes, to sacrifice everything, health, happiness, humanity, on the altar of wealth and status and the desperate need to prove we matter, when all along the only things that matter are the things no amount of money can buy, the things Cornelius Vanderbilt II understood too late as he sat paralyzed in his palace, surrounded by gold leaf and marble and all the proof of his success, and realized that he'd spent his entire life building a prison, that the breakers had broken him, and that the price of being a Vanderbilt was higher than any fortune could pay.